turn your microphone off so that nothing interrupts the sound. But if you want to ask a question, you can turn your microphone back on by going to the top of your screen, the black bar where it says Google, and the left-hand button says mute microphone. You can also use the chat box on the right of your screen if you are having any problems or if you want to ask a question. Yeah? Okay, so my name is Alison Reynolds from International Tibet Network. So it's my privilege to introduce today's Hangout and to welcome everybody here and also anybody watching online to our campaign challenge. So after the Brussels Tibet Group conference last September, the Network Steering Committee made a commitment to embark on a strategic review, recognising that these are very challenging times for the Tibet movement. And so it's extremely important we use our resources to maximum effectiveness and to really think about the campaigns that we do and how they could lead to real change in Tibet. So in the coming weeks, we're going to be asking groups to think more about this and send us your ideas on what achievable campaigns we ought to be focusing on. And I'll say a bit more about that process at the end of today's session. But firstly, most importantly, it's to introduce you to John Jackson, who is going to help us kickstart this process with what will be a very thought-provoking presentation to get your creative juices going. So John is a very long-standing friend of Tibet. He's a veteran of the Burma Campaign. Some of you may know him as co-author of the book Small Acts of Resistance, which celebrates the courageous and often humorous ways in which ordinary people have stood up to tyranny around the world and won. John is now an independent strategy consultant, and he will be helping us with our strategic review. Regretfully, internet problems in Bulgaria mean that Tendor is unable to join us, but I will do my best to support John's presentations with some thoughts about how these ideas that he's sharing kind of relate to the Tibet movement. I did say at the start that if you had Skype open on your computer, it would be a good idea to turn that off because it does use a lot of bandwidth. And as I say, please use the chat box or unmute your microphone if you have a question at any time. But for now, over to you, John.
Thanks, Ali. Happy New Year, everyone. I hope you've all had a good start to 2017. It's great to be talking with you today because, as Ali mentioned, I'm an old friend of the Tibet campaign here in the UK. So I'm particularly happy to be able to share some thoughts with you all on campaigning, which I hope will be useful. I know there's going to be a variety of different experiences that people have had running campaigns or being part of campaigns. So I'm hoping that there's still going to be quite a lot of what I'm saying that will be new and hopefully useful to people watching. I'm going to be talking about the kind of the key concepts, the bare essentials of campaigning that strategists think through when they're deciding what type of campaign to run, how to run it, how to make the most impact with it. And I'm going to divide the presentation into 3 parts. At the end of each part, I'm going to speak, at the end of each part, we'll take 5, possibly 10 minutes for questions. And those questions should be mainly around clarification of what I've said. So if anyone feels they haven't understood, or if I have not been clear, or I've spoken too fast, whatever it might be, the break at the end of each of those 3 sections will be to clarify what I've just said, because we will have more time at the end for a discussion and to hear your insights, your comments, and your thoughts about campaigning in general, but also specifically some of the challenges for Tibet. So just to kind of say that those 3 sections, those questions were mainly to make sure that everyone is with me, that I've been clear, and that hopefully you're all still awake at the end of the presentation. And so what I'm going to try and do now, and I'm not the most technical person, but I'm going to try and put some slides up on your screens. So hopefully everyone will be able to see what I'm talking about. So fingers crossed. Right. Is there a way of me knowing that everyone can see that? Ali, can you see it? Hello?
Yes. Yes, I can see it, John.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll assume that everyone else can see that. Right.
Susan's
So
holding up her.
okay, cool. So as I said, the concepts I'm going to talk about are aimed at maximizing the impact of your campaigning efforts. And by applying this type of thinking, strategists and campaigners are able to basically map out a path towards achieving their goals. And so the key starting point for strategists and campaigners in any campaign that they're going to run is the aim. And the aim, as we define it, is the ultimate destination you want to arrive at. What will have changed in the world if you get what you want? It's what everything you do should be working towards. And although that might sound obvious, I have encountered campaigns that have not been clear about their aim. And because there hasn't been clarity about the aim, it means that everything else that is built on top of that isn't quite strategic, isn't quite clear, and sometimes is not so effective. And I'm going to take some historical and contemporary examples of each of these concepts. With the civil rights movement in the US, the aim was very clear. It was equal civil rights for Black Americans, and that included desegregation of public education and transport. For the pro-democracy movement on Burma, it was a democratically elected government through free and fair elections. And I'm going to talk about this campaign, which is a new campaign in the UK. So if there's anyone watching from the UK, they'll probably be aware of this campaign. It's called Stop Funding Hate. And I think it's an interesting campaign, which is why I'm including it in these examples. The aim of the campaign is to end hateful press reporting in some of Britain's, I guess, worst newspapers that are very divisive when they're talking about immigration, refugees, minority groups, they're Islamophobic or homophobic. So it's those newspapers which sell themselves on hateful reporting. But I'll come back to that campaign a little bit later. So if the aim is your destination, your ultimate change that you want, then the objectives are the interim goals you need to achieve to help you get to that destination. In a way, they are your stations. They're the places you have to travel through and pass in order to achieve your ultimate aims. And it's these objectives that we're going to concentrate on today. They're the goals that form the individual campaigns that a movement needs to carry out. So I'll continue using these three real examples of the civil rights movement, Burma, and Stop Funding Hate. So the objectives for the civil rights movement were to force bus companies, cafes, restaurants to change their segregation rules. And we'll be looking at the bus boycott, which is one of the campaigns that they ran for the example that we'll be talking about today. And so I'm sure most people know about what happened with the civil rights movement, but just as a recap, the bus boycott, some people will recognize Rosa Parks in this photograph, who was one of the sparks for the boycott. It's where in the segregated southern states of America, Black people were forced to sit at the back of the bus. And if all of the seats taken for white people were full and there were other white people who got on the bus, then the Black people were forced to stand for those white passengers. And Rosa Parks, on one occasion, refused to stand, and she was arrested for doing so. And that was the trigger for the Montgomery bus boycott. And so the objective of the boycott was to force bus companies, the bus authority, to desegregate, to change those rules. For Burma, one of the objectives for the campaigns was to stop companies, particularly Western companies, working with the military regime in Burma. And it was part of the overall aim of cutting finance to the military regime. And one of the companies that they targeted was British American Tobacco, which owned cigarette brands like 555, Lucky Strike, and Rothmans. And you can see one of the images that the campaign used for that campaign here. And so British American Tobacco had a joint venture cigarette factory with the military regime in Burma. And so the simple objective was to force British American Tobacco to pull out of Burma, to end its business with the military. And Stop Funding Hate, its objective is to force individual companies like Lego to stop advertising in some of the most hateful newspapers among Britain's press, therefore denying those newspapers a source of finance, and hopefully then changing the way that they report the news. So once you've got your objectives, the next most important thing is to understand who the targets are. And the targets are basically the individuals or institutions that can make the decision that achieves your objective. So it's who can take the final action that creates the change. And it's very important to identify who they are and to know as much about them as possible. Much of what you will be doing will be to either coerce or convince and persuade your decision makers to do what you want. For the civil rights movement, for the bus boycott, the target was the mayor of Montgomery, who was in charge of public transport policy. His name was W.A. Gale. For the British American Tobacco campaign, there was Ken Clarke, who is pictured here. He doesn't normally look that frightening, but he is an MP. He was in fact the finance secretary in the UK, what we call the Chancellor of the Exchequer for Margaret Thatcher. And he was the chairman of British American Tobacco. So British American Tobacco's board of directors and Ken Clarke were the targets for the campaign on BAT. And for Stop Funding Hate, the target is the management of Lego. You know, Lego is a children's brand. It's publicly stated its corporate values, which are inclusive and tolerant. And so it's a particularly useful target for this campaign. But we'll talk more about that in a short while. So that's the aim, the ultimate destination, the objectives, the kinds of interim goals you need to achieve to get your ultimate destination, and then the targets, the people who you need to focus most of your attention and pressure on in order to make the change happen. At this point, I'm going to pause, and I just want to see if there are any questions that people might have.
Let me know if you want any sort of Tibet examples included, John. Any points?
I think, should we see if there's any questions first? And if not, maybe we'll, It could be that I was crystal clear, which is great. And therefore there are no questions, but. So Ali, maybe it would be worth looking at some examples from Tibet.
Well, I mean, I was going to just briefly touch on the aim, because obviously within the Tibet movement, there are a range of destinations from Ume Lam to Rangzen, and that's often been considered a weakness in the movement. But I don't think it should necessarily be viewed as such, as long as the individual campaigns themselves are very clear about their aim. Obviously, the movement can rally around specific objectives, as you described, and I also think there is more potential for these larger aims of Ume Lam and Rangzen to strategically complement each other. For example, His Holiness's middle way is only in the middle if it is between the two extremes of independence for Tibet and total assimilation by China. So that was just to touch on aims, but of course there's never been any shortage of objectives the Tibet movement could work on, end of nomad settlement, stopping foreign investment in projects, release of political prisoners, for example. But your point, which is so critical, is how do these individual campaigns advance us towards the overall aim? So, for example, we've always seen campaigning for political prisoners as being strategically valuable, not just because those individuals might get freedom, but because doing so brings hope to Tibetans in Tibet that are engaged in resistance. It puts China's policies under the scrutiny of international bodies such as the Committee Against Torture, and ultimately one would hope that if we were successful, it could create more space for Tibetans in Tibet to resist China's rule. So, that's just one example, but I think with all the other campaigns that we look at, it's defining how they fit into that path, the stations that they represent that take us to our overall aim that is so interesting.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add that.
Great. So if there are no questions or of clarification, we'll move on, and we will have time to discuss, I think, the point you just made there, Ali, further at the end.
Right.
Great. So I'm going to try and do the sharing again. Let's see. Right, so we've looked at the aim, objectives, and targets. Once you know who your targets are, you need to identify who can most influence them to make the decision that you want. So as you can see, everything, I'm probably going to be a little bit repetitive here because it always goes back to the decision that you want, the change that you want. So who can influence your targets, and whether that influence is coercive. And when I say coercive, what I mean, for example, the bus boycott was in some sense financially coercive. A boycott of a business imposes to some extent a financial cost to the target. So coercive, persuasive, moral, or economic. Who are the people, the groups, the organizations, the institutions that can influence your target? For the civil rights movement, it was the bus passengers themselves, the Black African-American bus passengers. They were the people who were paying for the service, but yet in this case, they were also those who had been treated unjustly by the service that they were paying for. But they had until this point accepted reluctantly the fact that they did have to sit at the back and they did have to stand up for others when they got on the bus. But those were one of the key influences. There would be other influences as well, but that's just an example of one key influential constituency for the bus boycott campaign. For the British American Tobacco campaign, Ken Clarke and the board of BAT were the targets. And we knew that there was no way cigarette consumers would necessarily care about this issue because they're cigarette consumers. But we knew that for a company like British American Tobacco, it was more likely going to be the press, the financial press, the trade press, the business press, that would have more influence over the board of directors and of Ken Clark. And it was the press's potential for having impact on the company's brand and the brand's reputation, and therefore a risk to its share price, that most mattered. You know, if the company was doing risky business in Burma, that was not good for shareholders. So the most influential community for us would be key sections of the press. And for Stop Funding Hate, who were targeting Lego, Lego is very concerned about its reputation. It's a children's toy brand. And so therefore, what parents think of Lego is critical to the success of that brand. And as a children's brand, it stands for certain principles, or so it says. So the key influencer for Lego was the opinion of parents. And another key influential element of that was the role of social media. But we'll come to that a little bit later. So if we look at those three campaigns, if we just look quickly at the results, the Montgomery bus boycott, it lasted for a year, and at times there were 90% of Black passengers staying off the buses. Black-owned taxis organized carpools for the same cost as bus tickets to get people to work. Eventually, the district court in Montgomery ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional, and then the Supreme Court eventually confirmed that decision and ruled it as unconstitutional. And Martin Luther King said that they had chosen tired feet over tired souls, and they had decided to walk in dignity rather than ride in humiliation. With British American Tobacco, after 11 months of campaigning, that included a variety of actions and tactics that included shareholder actions, protests outside its offices, a constant drip feed to the press exposing labor and human rights violations connected with BAT's factory. After 11 months, BAT announced it was pulling out of Burma. And Stop Funding Hate, which only launched as a campaign, and it launched as a single Facebook page to say, this is our idea, this is what we want to do. It launched in August. It started running its campaign on individual companies, including Lego. And in November, Lego announced over Twitter that it was no longer going to have any kind of contract or business with the Daily Mail, which is one of those newspapers that is seen in the UK to be very divisive and hateful in the way that it reports. So that's just a quick summary of where those three campaigns have ended up on those particular objectives. And in fact, one of the parents, just back on the Lego, when it announced, it said that it had made this decision because it was concerned by what its customers were saying to it. And those customers, obviously, largely parents. One parent in an open letter that went viral on Facebook said, "It genuinely bothers me that a great progressive company like yours supports this and newspaper in inverted commas, supports this newspaper, helping to increase its circulation." So there were really good examples where parents directly put out on social media or directly expressed to the company their concerns about the company advertising in that type of newspaper. So we've looked at aims, objectives, targets, and then who can influence those targets. Connected to those influencers are your allies. Once you know who your key influencers are, it's crucial to then identify who your existing allies are among those influencers, because they're the people who you can have most immediate success in mobilizing, in activating. And you've already thought through that here are some people who are going to influence your target. If within those influences you have allies, that's a really great opportunity. So it's one of the first things that you will look at. But most successful campaigns and movements have reached out and extended their base of support. So it's really crucial to cultivate existing allies, but it's also massively important to reach out and create new allies among the influences that you have identified, because ultimately they are the ones who are going to be able to push your targets in the right direction. A really interesting example of where this has had incredible success in the last 5 to 10 years is the global gay rights movement. The gay rights movement, until about 5 to 10 years ago, was very much organized around speaking to the gay community, the lesbian and gay community. And at a certain point, the strategy changed, and they started having what some people have called an allies strategy, where they realized that for every gay and lesbian person, there were brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, co-workers, friends who could be advocates, who could be allies for the types of changes that they wanted. And they very successfully started to concentrate on those allies rather than just speak to their own community. And you can see how legislation on things like same-sex marriage has really, really taken off, especially in Europe and North America. So I think that really is a really very interesting example. With Burma, the Burma pro-democracy movement internationally, they really spent a lot of time investing in relationships with trade unions, with church networks, faith networks, journalists, politicians, to build up a broader base of support. And with the Stop Funding Hate, it's a new campaign started in August, but it already seems to be broadening its appeal. And it's even attracted members of the Conservative Party in Parliament, despite a lot of the newspapers that it's targeting in its campaign being conservative newspapers. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of that campaign. And we know that the civil rights movement had a very, very powerful place within the church network in the US, but it was also very good at reaching across racial and religious divides in everything that it did. And I think one of the key things was in every way that it articulated its vision of what America could be, it was inclusive and allowed people who were not Black, who were not living in the southern states, who were not experience segregation themselves, was allowing others to see their role and themselves in the movement. So the more your allies and even your opponents can adopt your agenda, the better the chance of succeeding. So I'm going to stop at this point for any possible questions. And it's fine if they're not, but there aren't any. Shall I continue?
Can I just briefly make an observation that what you just covered on allies is, I think, very important. I think there have been a few key campaigns in the Tibet movement where allies have been incredibly important, and people who remember the World Bank might remember a couple of organizations in the United States that were specifically focused on the World Bank, but also, you know, on environmental issues, whose involvement was critical. But I think on the whole, the Tibet movement has not built such strong alliances as other movements have. And I was very struck by that example of the gay rights community if you think about it, it's so obvious and it makes perfect sense, but I hadn't thought about it until you said. But, you know, I think as a movement, we really need to look at more at that.
Mm. And it was quite a rapid transformation once they stopped just speaking to themselves and realized that there was a massive pool of allies with significant power. They were able to achieve a lot more. It's a very particular example, though, because it's an issue which of being connected to or knowing someone who might be gay. So there's lots of options for having personal connections. So it's particular in that sense, but it's, I think, still a great example of building allies. Okay, I'm gonna share again. So we've got our aims, our objectives, the targets who can make the decisions we want, the influencers who can apply pressure, persuasion on those targets. We have identified the allies amongst those influencers who we can quite quickly or more easily mobilize. And then we've looked at the allies amongst those the influencers who are not yet allies, and seen which ones could possibly become allies in order to broaden the power base of the movement. Once we've got all of that, we power map. Now, the power map is basically the relationship between all of these things. So how do your objectives, your targets, your influencers, and your allies connect and influence each other? Because by understanding those connections and those relationships and those interests, you then start to know what the obstacles are on your path. And you have to understand the obstacles in order to be able to either avoid them, go around them, or knock them down. But the power map just gives you a clear understanding of where the power lies, and how best to influence it and use it. Sometimes a power map will throw up groups and individuals that you would never normally engage with, but who might have to be engaged with because they're highly influential to your target. And I'm working on a project at the moment with a trade union in the UK, and it's a trade union that sits very much on the left of British politics. It's a public service union that has experienced lots of cuts, and it has mainly talked to the wider union movement and has mainly talked to the left wing of British politics, so the Labour Party and other civil society organizations. I've been working with it, and we've had a conservative government since 2010, and we looked at some of the key influencers and allies who could actually influence the conservative government, and they're people that this union have never ever engaged with, but actually have a lot of opportunity and potential to bring some of these audiences on their side who might have a lot more chance to influence government policy. So it's been an interesting process with them, but it's a really good example where they've spoke to the converted, they've spoken to the people who are already on their side, but who don't necessarily have as much sway and as much influence with the targets who they need to influence. And the power map process helped us identify where those gaps were in who they need to engage, and also how they need to engage them. So once you have your power map and you know who you need to mobilize, and who you need to recruit and bring on board, it's critical that you identify what type of action you want people to take. And campaigners and strategists often think of action in terms of high barrier and low barrier. So they're entry points for people to participate in the campaign that you're running. And basically it's like a ladder. So where the easiest actions are at the bottom and the most committed, maybe more involved or more difficult action is at the top. And so the range of actions might look like, especially if you are, which nearly all campaigns have to these days, you have to have a digital online component. So if the actions range from online to offline, it could look like the easiest being to view a piece of your content, to share that content, to comment on it, to sign up to the campaign or sign up to a petition. But then it starts to become more and more involved, where people might attend a meeting or attend a rally, or they might donate money to the cause. They might lobby a decision maker. They might become organizers themselves. So as you can see, it starts to gradually become a more committed involvement. And it's really crucial to make sure that the action you're calling for is appropriate to the influencers you are targeting. So if you want the influencers to take an action, it's really key to make sure it's appropriate to whichever group of people within the set of influencers you have. Otherwise, you might lose the ones who are not yet very committed if you give them something that's far too involved, far too difficult. And you might underuse the ones who are very committed, who could be doing much more. And so it's really good to understand who are all the people that you can mobilize, to what extent can you mobilize them, and what is the most appropriate actions for them. And for that purpose, it's really good to have a range of tactics that you know will impact your targets in some way through your influencers, via your influencers, and that, you know, that range of tactics must be considered carefully in terms of the appropriateness, high barrier or low barrier. Connected to that is understanding motivation. So to assess what's appropriate, you need to know as much as you can about your influencers. In the Burma campaign, if we were working on a company, maybe the CEO of a company, we would want to know, apart from the business connections that that CEO had in that company, we'd want to know, were they an honorary chancellor of a university? Were they part of a faith community? You know, we'd want to know as much as possible about that target in order to know how best to influence it or influence them. So likewise with your influencers, you want to know, you know, why would they take the action you're promoting? You really have to ask that question and interrogate that question, because sometimes when you're in a campaign, it all makes sense to you because you're interested, you're motivated, and you think, well, why wouldn't anyone just do this simple thing? And it's really interesting once you start to ask the question, well, why would they? Sometimes you throw up reasons that are your reasons rather than their reasons. So understand what moves them. Is it political? Is it economic? Is it moral? Is it emotional? Should it be something very tangible that you want them to do, or is it more appropriate to give them something more symbolic? And you can only know these things by really studying and researching who your influencers are. Once you have all of that, you can start looking at what your theory of change is. And one way of describing what that is, it's the logic of the path that you believe will make change. So if X takes this action, then Y will happen, resulting in Z. So the reason why I've been talking about Stop Funding Hate, because I think they have a quite simple theory of change, which is very clear. If the customers of brands become and express their anger about what the brands, who the brands are advertising with, the brands will see their reputation being threatened and damaged. And to stop the damage, brands have to stop advertising in those newspapers. So it's very straightforward. And you could add another element to that. If the brands stop advertising in those newspapers, the newspapers have to rethink how they report on important issues. So understanding your theory of change is really the synopsis, the kind of the clear, simple way that you can express to your movement and to the outside world of how your change will come about through the activities that you take. Narrative is probably one of the most important things that successful campaigns do well. And 2016 has been a year of narratives, not necessarily for the best of reasons or for good causes, but I think the year has really been one where storytelling has shown that it's more powerful than facts. There's lots of studies in a variety of universities, particularly ones like Yale in the US and Stanford and others. Cognitive sciences has been looking at this, and there's been lots of experiments and thought experiments. But if facts challenge a strongly held pre-existing belief, the fact is often discarded. But not only that, the fact actually sometimes, the opposing fact can sometimes strengthen the pre-existing belief. And there's lots of evidence of how this works when it comes particularly to climate change denial, but lots of other examples as well. I think the Trump campaign has got great examples of how, despite what might seem like a fact, opposing what Trump has said or his campaign has said, on many occasions, it actually strengthened people's support for Trump. It's really important to understand what the current narrative is for your targets and for your influencers, because you will need to understand what the existing narrative is to know what problems it's going to cause you, but also how might you change that narrative, or how might you use that narrative for the purposes of your campaign. And successful narratives tend to have certain elements to them. They're emotional or emotive. They often have a sense of urgency, that there's something that really needs to be dealt with and solved now. And they're well targeted. They know who the audiences are that are going to respond to them. And if you look at Trump, Make America Great Again is a very neat, simple encapsulation of the overall narrative that he was telling. With Brexit in the UK, take back control of your country or your life, was again another neat encapsulation. Now, they told stories that people believed and that rang true for people, irrespective of whether facts could be presented that supported it or not. The story itself was what made the campaign so effective. Now, a good campaign should be backed up with facts. It's always good to have it's better to have integrity in the work that you're doing. But really, it's critical that, yes, you should have the facts, but you should back up the facts with powerful storytelling. And an element of the narrative and the storytelling is understanding values. What are the dominant values that are held by your influencers and by your targets? Can they be used in your narrative? Can you reframe them? Is it possible to use unusual voices to tell your story? Is it possible to offer surprising solutions within the story? And connected to all of that is identity. Identity is critical to campaigns and to movements for a number of reasons. One, it builds a sense of community, a sense of common purpose and solidarity, making people feel part of what you're doing, recognizing themselves and their role in your movement or your campaign. A clear identity also gives a sense of scale and power, because if you're identifiable either visually or by your name, or by the story that you tell, the bigger a community you look like, the more influence you're likely to have over the targets that you have identified. And I think a good example of identity building that came up in around 2011 was the Occupy movement. The "We Are the 99% was, again, encapsulated a much bigger narrative, but it's packed with meaning for many, many people. So if you saw the protests around the world at the height of the Occupy movement, I think it was 65 cities around the world, the people participating in those demonstrations and protests were holding up "We Are the 99% in their placards and their banners, and they all saw themselves as the 99%. It was a very, very powerful identity symbol. Another key element of successful campaigns is to be responsive to the world that you're in and the society that you're campaigning in. So jumping on useful news stories is a really powerful way of remaining relevant and keeping your issue alive and topical. So it's much easier to tap into existing conversations than to start ones. And then you can use those to carry your message and your actions. It's also easier to mobilize existing communities rather than creating new ones. So a strategist will always ask, well, where are the opportunities to mobilize existing communities, and how might we do that? The other thing with being responsive is that you need to feel able and feel free to change track if the world and the context changes. There's no point in sticking to a plan if it's no longer relevant and if no one's listening. It's really important to be able to change, because sometimes you'll find campaigns that have been going for many, many years. There's lots of reasons why people have invested in what's being done. And it's not that you abandon the objectives or the goals necessarily, but it's like, if you're continuing to do the same thing, but it's not showing any progress, then you have to question whether you continue to do it. And it's the same thing with the topicality and the relevance of what you're working on. You need to be responsive to the context around you. Quick wins is, for me, one of the most useful things a campaign can do, especially in the early stages of its launch. I would always ask, if I was developing a campaign, what might be the quick and easy wins? Because if you can get some victories under your belt, no matter how small, they start to show forward momentum. They start to show that you are effective, and that encourages existing supporters, and it also helps you recruit new members. And even if they're small, the more victories you can get under your belt, it starts to potentially psychologically influence your targets, because they start to see the momentum and they start to see you gaining influence and they start to see you having success. And that starts to change the way they see you and the way that they might relate to you. So quick wins are really, really useful, especially at the early stages of a campaign. It does not mean that you lose vision or sight of your bigger picture and your bigger objectives and your ultimate aims, but it's a really useful building block before you start to get really going with the big things that you're tackling. And with the Burma campaign, we did the easy victories very well. So we targeted smaller companies or smaller changes in government policy. And then when we got those, we fed back, and we fed back very, very clearly to our members, to the press, to the newspapers, to everyone, and we shouted about it. And that's another critical thing, because the more you feed back to the people who are taking action for you, who if you feed back the results, and sometimes it doesn't have to be a victory, it can be someone's made a statement, someone's expressed support who hadn't expressed support before. It's really finding those things that you can celebrate to encourage further actions and build further support. Those little things are really, really important, and eventually they lead to bigger things. So with all of that, the thing that brings it all together is your campaign plan. And that is basically what activities will you undertake over what time frame to maintain your mobilization, to maintain your pressure, and to influence your targets. Most targets of campaigns are happy to wait it out. If a campaign's launched, you know, in many cases they might stay relatively silent, or they may say something in response, but they're unlikely to do anything quickly, because they think, well, eventually you will run out of steam, you will run out of resources, you will get discouraged, and they just need to sit it out. But if they know that that's not going to happen, if they start to see that your campaign is building and there's action after action, that you're tenacious, that you're persistent, it starts to change their calculations. Again, it starts to change the way they see you, and it starts to make them reevaluate the cost of what they're doing that you think they should not be doing. So the plan simply really makes sure that you've thought of everything, you don't run out of steam, you don't run out of ideas or activities, and it's very, very critical. And so finally, in terms of what I'm talking about is evaluation. During the course of a campaign, it really is important to keep evaluating whether your activities are doing what you want them to do in relation to your goals, in relation to your objectives. If they're not doing what you planned, then you need to rethink. There's no point in being busy for the sake of being busy. And so evaluation, it really helps you to just keep checking in with yourself, with your campaign, that you're doing what you should be doing. And if not, what's the alternative? How do you re-strategize? Or how do you change your tactics? Or is there a new target that has emerged because of a change of what's happened out in the world? It helps you to look at all of these things and be nimble and be responsive. And that's, I think, you know, you should be looking at evaluation both in terms of the short-term things within your campaign, but also in the long term across all of the campaigns you're running and your overall aim. So that's pretty much all the key concepts I wanted to talk about. I wanted to just share a very short video from Stop Funding Hate, which I've been talking about, just because I think it doesn't have every aspect of what I've been talking about, but it's got certain key elements which I think are very useful to see. It's very clear about its theory of change. It's clear about its objective, clear about its targets. The action it asks for is simple and clear, and it tells a strong and compelling story, and a story that draws from the values of its targets and draws from the values of its influencers, who are the customers of these brands. So I just thought I'd share that before we then go into questions and any discussion. Oh, I should say, sorry, that this was brought out at Christmas. And for those of you not in the UK, around Christmas time, a lot of the big brands have very, how would you put it, warm and comforting, and, you know, the spirit of humanity being full of love and compassion. They have ads that touch on those values, and they use those ads to associate themselves, associate those values with their brand. And so this is what the ad is drawing on. It's drawing on the tradition of Christmas ads in the UK. So that's it. I think if there are any questions, and we can also have a discussion as well.
So any questions from anybody about John's presentation? You can either use the chat box, or you can turn your video and your microphone on and ask a question that way. Claudio wants to say something. Mandy, can you unmute him?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Claudio.
Thank you very much, John, for your very amazing and clear presentation. A lot of things, very planned in a scheme that make clear to us many things. And we can start from this to imagine, to think, to few effective things for this year. But the main thing I want to start to say is that to plan a campaign for Tibet, we need, first of all, we need a pushing from the Tibetan themselves, from the Tibetan government, and from the Tibetan community in our countries. For example, in Italy, we have very few Tibetans living here, maybe 150. And as times go by, we feel as an old support group. I introduce briefly myself. I am Claudio Cardelli, President of Italia Tibet Association. I am, unfortunately, one of the founders of this association 30 years ago, and my relation with Tibetans back to 70s. So I'm old man, tomorrow 67.
Happy birthday.
Verde, yes.
Young at heart, Claudio.
I want to participate to this. Ellie knows that usually I don't go to support group meetings, but this time I wanted to participate because I think we are in a very crucial moment. Because as we have seen the last year, China is becoming very strong, stronger and stronger, very arrogant. We have seen the matter of Mongolia that for us was very hope. When His Holiness went to Mongolia, all of us were very happy because, and also Taiwan and great hope. And now we see the reaction of China is every time stronger and more arrogant. You can see also in Kalachakra now in Bodh Gaya, we have seen a very incredible films. So as support group, old member of support group, I think that in this crucial time, we need a special inspiration by the Tibetan institution in exile. That I feel in the last years I missed a lot, because the hope of the middle way path, that I was one of the first sponsor of the middle way approach many years ago, has flown away. And so we have to choose how to discuss with China, if possible. I think it's not possible, how to fight against China in a non-violent way, absolutely. How to touch the nerve of China in the sensible. And I think economy can be the only one sensible nerve of China in this moment. And after this, we have to choose our allies, come si dice? Alleati.
Alliances.
Yes. And last year and now I stop because I don't want to monopolize the discussion. Last year we had a good relation with the movement, Five Stars movement in Italy, that is the main opposition parties in Italy in this moment. And in my long story, I have seen one thing that everybody of you can have seen, that the parties, when they are at the government, they became immediately silent on the Tibetan issue. And when they are in opposition, they like to show themselves for human rights, for democracy, and so on. So this is another big problem, because in the past we had Massimo D'Alema, Walter Beltroni, they're all members of the government party in Italy that were talking friend of Tibet, but now we have no space, no windows, no doors to get from the government party in Italy, PD, any help, because China is stronger and the economy hope is only hope for me. And so I think I need inspiration from the Tibetan government, from Lobsang Sangye, from His Holiness himself, that have to push us to become more effective, more strong, and more hard. I think that if the middle way have failed, the Tibetan government must not turn to the independence that is a dream, but must became more and more critical and denounce the Chinese regime, not to try to flirt, to find a private corridor that this year showed that does not exist. So this is my thought after your presentation. Anyway, thank you very much.
Shall I just say a couple of words?
Yeah.
In response to Claudio? I think that, I mean, just on one quick point, I think that CTA's language towards China has become quite a bit stronger of late. I think they are being more critical of China. But just broadly, the network strategic campaign plan, as it currently stands, divides its eggs into different baskets. We have 4 different ideas of how change might come about in Tibet. The first is about amplifying Tibetan resistance and, you know, really kind of highlighting and mirroring the ways Tibetans resist, for the reasons that I said at the beginning with the political prisoners campaign, to give hope to Tibetans in Tibet, to show that we are listening, and to give them space to continue their resistance. The second is that government to government engagement, so getting our governments to talk about Tibet directly with China, will lead to change. And as you pointed out, Claudia, that is becoming increasingly difficult because our governments are increasingly reluctant to criticize China. The third theory of change we have is that Chinese leaders are vulnerable to external pressure, direct pressure on them. And that when they visit, you know, if we protest and if we communicate, send our message directly to them, that might lead them to think in the long term, and also younger leaders coming up, about how this problem is not going to go away and what they should do about it. And the fourth one is that change in Tibet will come from change within China, and that if we work with Chinese activists and Mongolians and Uyghurs, then that might lead to change. But there may be more than that. There may be more ideas about how change could come about, and that's really what this process is about, is getting the groups to take on board all this information that John has shared and try to think as creatively as possible about what possibilities there might be for greater success for the movement, given that we have limited resources, given, you know, looking at all the things that we have in our favor. And so, John, have you, because after this webinar, we're going to be sharing a questionnaire and asking you to get your groups together to go through it. Have you got any tips how to encourage us all to sort of think a bit outside the box, to try to think a bit differently to how we've been thinking in the past, so that we can see if there are new ideas out there we can take on board?
Yep. Listening to what I've just heard, it just reminds me of Desmond Tutu used to always say this African proverb, which may not be totally appropriate here, but I think there's an element of it. And he said there's only one way to eat an elephant, and that is one spoon at a time. And I think when a movement has been trying for many, many years to get some change and some progress, and the obstacles seem to become even bigger, and the chances of shifting things seem to look even more difficult, it can start to affect the way we see change, and it starts to look like change just becomes more and more distant and more and more unachievable. And I think at a stage like that, it's really useful to almost start to try and step back and forget a little bit of the history and forget a little bit of what you've been doing, and to try and look at it with new eyes. And I think that's usually a good starting place when you're thinking about what are the other possible opportunities, not to definitely take and start doing, but what are the other possible opportunities that might not have been considered. And in order to do that, you have to almost stop, you have to not be judgmental about yourself or the group that you're in and what is being said. You have to be willing to almost say some stupid stuff. If that sounds bizarre, you have to be willing to say stuff that you might be reluctant to say because you don't know whether it will be considered intelligent or have an insight or be very smart and really understand the global politics or the national politics of China or the big geopolitical interests. If you start trying to have all of that in your mind when you're trying to think of what the new opportunities are, you will get stuck, because it's not possible for most people to have all of those factors in their minds when they're starting to think afresh, what are the possibilities? And to think of what the possibilities are, you need to just open up the conversation. And to open up the conversation, people need to feel comfortable to say potentially, to give out ideas which are potentially not going to be taken. They might not be ideas that people think are good ones, but you need to be able to say that. So that would be my starting point, is to really brainstorm and to start bit by bit. So rather than think of what are the really big big problems that are facing Tibet, start to just take chunks and look at within each chunk, what are the opportunities for a change in policy, or a change in legislation, or a change in trade relationships, or a change in migration and settlements. Looking at each of those and thinking creatively about the ways you might first of all gain some small victories. And I go back to that small victories thing. I don't know to what extent small victories have been common for the wider Tibet movement in the last maybe 5 years or so. There may be some examples, but it's really important, if you feel that, I don't know how membership has been going or how broader support has been, but if you feel that it hasn't been growing, or if you feel that it may even be reducing, there's a need to mobilize people. And to mobilize people, you need to have discrete, well thought out, imaginative campaigns that will appeal to people, that will give you some small victories that will help you to start, in a sense, rebuilding and re-energizing the movement. So that would be my starting point. You can't factor in all of the things that you need to factor in with the politics. Would be impossible to start at that point.
I've just put in the chat window a couple of links that people might find useful. The first is a digital presentation of successful Tibet campaigns. And John's absolutely right. As a movement, we have had our successes, and we've had more than we perhaps sometimes remember. But there aren't lots and lots of them. And I think that we could be better at celebrating them. So we created this presentation to remind ourselves of what they've been, and perhaps they'll give you some inspiration, and perhaps you can share them with other people who would be inspired or rejuvenated by seeing them. And the second one is a report that we did a while ago about the kinds of tactics that the Tibet movement has used, and included some suggestions on kind of new sorts of tactics that it would be good to use. One of which I think is we've talked a lot about is humour. And I was very inspired reading Small Acts of Resistance, the book that John wrote with Steve Crawshaw, because it really focused on the many humorous ways in which people stood up to tyranny. And humour has got an amazing ability to draw people to you. It feels safe. It feels really kind of appealing to people, and it's definitely something that as a movement we don't find a lot to laugh about, of course, because the situation in Tibet is so dreadful. But there are things out there that do make us smile about the creative and fun ways. I mean, thinking of the Tibetan monks and their swear box, or for using words in Chinese, little examples like that. So do take a look at those things if there's any inspiration from you can draw. Are there any other questions or suggestions that people in the Hangout would like to share? Mandy, have we got any other questions coming in that we want to put to John at the moment?
Is Mandy still on mute?
She might be, but she can
Right.
say something in the chat window.
What is the next step after this, Ali?
Yes, thank you, Claudio. So with John's help, we have drawn up a questionnaire. It's similar to, but the questions are different from the last time we did this process, which was 2007, 2008. We were looking at what campaigns we should be working on after the Olympics, because that was the big focus. So these questions are designed to really make you think about, you know, these possibilities, these opportunities and objectives that could lead to success and lead to change in Tibet, but could also, you know, reach new audiences. So we'll be sending that out to all Tibet groups with links to this video, so that if they haven't been able to join us, they can watch the presentation. And we'll give you a few weeks to get your groups together, and as John suggested, have as creative as possible a brainstorm about sort of those new ideas, and to be prepared to share with us, you know, things that might superficially seem a bit crazy. The crazier the better, as far as we're concerned. I think we want to really get the creative juices going. And then at our regional meetings, which European meeting will be in Riga in Latvia in early May, and the Asia meeting will be probably just a bit before that, and the Americas meeting we're hoping to have around that time as well. We'll collect all the feedback from these questionnaires, and we've got a task force of steering committee members and others, including Tendor, Dechin Pemba, Dennis, Georgie Seton, and others, who are going to sort of look at this and you know, come up with some recommendations of kind of new ideas that we could be taking up, and the regional meetings be a really good opportunity to sort of dig into those a bit more, and perhaps you know, even generate some additional ideas. And so later on in the year, the steering committee will look at all these suggestions, and we'll be saying, well, we are hoping to really kind of rejuvenate our strategic campaign plan by bringing these new ideas and these new theories of change on board. So that's the process. Tanya's just saying, yes, a comment about from Desislav about Trump's presidency and economic measures and restrictions to China. Well, this is a very, yes, geopolitical changes are major, let's face it. I think that the whole way in which the Tibet movement deals with the Trump presidency is a very, very difficult and sensitive issue. I think we really need to think very carefully about how to do that. On the one hand, you know, I can see that people are seeing that Trump is saying some slightly more hawkish things and being more critical of China. But on the other hand, I think we have to look at the support base we have and the allies that we have, and ask ourselves very carefully if those people would still be on our team if we were to get too close to the Trump administration. I think there are very significant political risks attached to getting too close to the Trump administration because of some of the other things he said, for example, about torture, and you know, just more broadly, you know, a lot of other horrible comments about Mexico and what have you. So this is something that Mandy and I have talked about a little bit, and we're hoping to have more of a conversation with the CTA about, to see what their position is, and to really think about very carefully. And it may be that, you know, in our hearts we are pleased to see sanctions against China, although that might be slightly ambitious. But I think that in terms of how we're perceived and our position, we just need to be extremely careful. That's my personal view. John, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I can see that it might present an opportunity and also a potential threat. But I think it's definitely worth exploring. And you know, and within that exploration, there are ways of seeing how, from a slightly at arm's length way, you might be able to try and influence things to your advantage. So trying to to China, but in a way where it doesn't associate the movement too closely with the Trump administration. That may or may not be possible, but it's one other way of approaching it.
Thank you. That's helpful. That's helpful. Claudia is saying better relations between China and USA will make China very nervous. Makes me nervous as well.
Yeah.
Any other comments or suggestions?
Well, we finished exactly 1 minute before time.
Amazing, amazing. Well, we'll share the link because this has been broadcast live on YouTube, and we'll make sure that link is available so that you can go back and you can go through John's presentation again and show it, make sure other people see it, because we want as many brains as possible. We need to get as many people involved in this process as we can, because everybody's contribution has merit, and ideas spark off against each other, and I think that's the way to get some new ideas going. So I would like to thank you all very much for giving of your time this morning. We'll be in touch and we'll look forward to hearing your feedback. And specifically, I would like to thank John. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and the way you present is so clear. It was really, really interesting, and I think it's given all of us a lot to think about. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Have a good day.
We'll be in touch. Thank you. You'll hear from us soon. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.